Okay, I think we're ready to get started here. First off, we want to thank Justin for joining us and doing his presentation tonight. As you can see, it's Mackinac Historical Society, and we're hosting Justin Carroll. We wanted to go through just a little bit of information before we get started, just so you know, all participants are muted, and the presentation is being recorded. That's part of the reason we don't want everybody muted, so there's not too much background noise and we can all hear what Justin has to say. And if you have any questions, Justin and I will both be watching the chat box, and you can see in the image below, if you hover your mouse over the bottom of your Zoom window, the chat bar should pop up. And you can just click on chat right there and put any questions in the chat box. And after the presentation, probably one day next week, the recording will be sent to everyone who registered, and the recording will come to your email. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Justin, and you can start whenever you're ready.
Thank you so much. My name is Justin Carroll, and I'm an associate professor of American history at Indiana University East. And I earned my PhD at Michigan State University, where Dr. Susan Sleeper-Smith was my advisor. And I believe Susan talked there last week. And Susan is such an instrumental person in terms of my own intellectual growth, my present career, and she's truly such truly a wonderful person. Before I begin talking about Askin, I'm going to tell two quick Susan stories, if that's okay, to highlight just how amazing she is as a person. Susan once took over an entire consortium, an academic consortium, to provide me and my fellow graduate students funding to work on our dissertations, to allow us to spend time outside of the classroom to work and write. And it is such a sacrifice and such a privilege to be able to work just on my project on Askin. And it wasn't uncommon during this period to see Susan leave her office at like 9 p.m. every night to ensure this work got done, to ensure that we had funding to continue our research. So this book wouldn't be here without Susan's amazing sacrifice. Also, Susan once stayed up to 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock in the morning in a freezing rental house in Sicily to ensure that she could talk to someone that I was interviewing with for a job. Interrupted her vacation, stayed up all night, answered a bunch of questions, and that job is the one job that I have now. So without Susan, I quite literally wouldn't be here. So it's fitting that I begin this by talking about Susan, because Susan is really the inspiration for my work on John Askin. She's the one who suggested that I study him, and after I became a graduate student in 2005. And as a graduate student, working on John Askin appealed to me because I found his failures more interesting than his successes in many ways. And there's something about investing a lot of time, money, energy, and emotion into something and having that fear that it might blow up in your face, which is, I think, a leitmotif in Askin's life, and certainly a motif in my own life as I've dealt with sort of the fears and anxieties of being a graduate student. So Askin's failures is what drove me to my study. The question began, why did Askin come to such a bad end at Mackinac? And my research project really began trying to piece this story together. Why did this happen? Why was his tenure at Mackinac ended on such a bad note? So I went about working my way through his written records in Detroit, at Ottawa, in Buffalo, in New York City, in Mackinac City, Ann Arbor, Chicago, and Wisconsin. I spent a lot of time working with Askin's published record. He has a very lovely 2-volume published record, published in the late 1920s and early 1930s. There's the Michigan Pioneer and Historical Collections and the Wisconsin Historical Collections. And I pieced all this stuff together to craft a narrative of Askin's life that tried to understand why his experience at Mackinac ended so disastrously. And over the last couple of weeks, I tried to piece together a really short narrative of his life that I think would convey this central message. And then I'll talk more specifically about some of the, I think, the interesting aspects in terms of how we think about the Great Lakes and how we think about the past as a whole. Askin was born in 1739. And let me pause here because if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to ask me on the Zoom chat. I teach a lot and I get interrupted by students in Zoom a lot, so it's not going to throw me off my thought process anyway. So feel free. I love answering questions, and that's my favorite thing to do. But let me begin. Askin was born in 1739 in a small village in the county of Tyrone in Northern Ireland to a man named James Askin, a shopkeeper, and a woman named Alice Ray. I learned very little about these two individuals in the course of my research. They had 5 children, and John Askin was the youngest of these children. In his letters, Askin wrote very little about his childhood and adolescence. And in fact, I think only one letter exists from the 1790s where he talks about his family in any kind of real depth. And he wrote that he feared that his Irish family were either, quote, dead or so dispersed that he could not obtain any satisfactory account of them, end quote. In 1758, at the height of the 7 Years' War, Askin is going to cross the Atlantic Ocean and settle in Albany. He became a sutler to the British Army, campaigning against the French and Indian allies along the St. Lawrence River. And it's in this capacity that Askin first encountered a man named Major Robert Rogers, tasked with securing the surrender of the Western French posts like Detroit and Mackinac. Rogers hoped to use his commission, his role as being one of the first British military officials into the Great Lakes to participate in this newly reopened fur trade. Askin and Rogers partnered in 1761, and over the next 2 years, Askin's fur trade blossomed and grew. He was focused primarily in his early career in the Anglo-Dutch fur trade communities of Schenectady and Albany. But over time, over this 2-year period, he developed commercial ties with the French community of Detroit, and participated heavily in the illicit smuggling of liquor. Overweening British military policies, the rapid influx of new British settlers, and the poor behavior of traders threatened indigenous sovereignty in the Great Lakes, and this resulted in something called Pontiac's War, which lasted between 1763 and 1766. Stymied east of Fort Niagara, Askin watched his fur trade collapse. His goods were lost, they were confiscated, or they went uncollected, and he returned to his creditors and suppliers empty-handed. He was bankrupt. In today's terms, imagine being in your early 20s and then almost overnight being a little under $1 million in debt, and then having a whole bunch of people calling for your arrest and some calling for much, much worse. It's a pretty intense situation. For a 20-year-old, I don't think I would have been able to bear it myself. In 1764, the British military regarrisoned the forts and posts captured during Pontiac's War, and Askin found a lifeline serving as a deputy commissary at Fort Michilimackinac at the tip of Michigan's Lower Peninsula. Tasked with ensuring the garrison received adequate supplies, Askin proved to be an able administrator as commissary. And he worked tirelessly to in the fulfillment of his duties. He established durable new ties with the Upper Great Lakes French and Indian communities and the wider British mercantile establishment that was developing both in Albany, but also in Montreal and Quebec. In the late 1760s and early 1770s, Askin became an increasingly important middleman for the Anglo-Dutch trading concerns in New York and Anglo-French outfits coming out of Quebec and Montreal. Askin used his position as a commissary to develop new ties strategically, and he began to invest heavily in the infrastructure to support the Great Lakes fur trade. What makes Askin, I think, really interesting is the degree to which he invests heavily in this infrastructure. He's really trying in his own way to come to terms with the fur trade, which is this huge, voluminous transatlantic endeavor. And in the late 18th century, I think people, the the shipping and the movement of goods is still very, very insecure. So by investing heavily in the Great Lakes fur trade infrastructure, by building multiple layers of multiple avenues of supply, both in New York and in Quebec and Montreal, Askin is beginning to diversify as a way of trying to forestall the disaster that he encountered after Pontiac's War. Askin's going to invest heavily in warehouses, in depots, in ships, in blacksmiths, in farms, bakeries. I mean, he's going to have corn drying stages. And in many ways, he's going to begin presaging the activity of the Northwest Company. Askin joins an Anglo-French partnership that worked to undercut the Hudson Bay Company by peeling off the best furs through cheaper goods coming up via through Montreal, but in particular liquor. Askin is going to, as I said before, invest quite heavily in the liquor trade. And in fact, you can go and you can read these letters in the Hudson Bay Company archive, and they're both very it's kind of humorous, but also kind of sad to read. I always left those. I always left reading those letters feeling kind of sad for the chief factor of New York, of the York factory in the Hudson Bay, having to write back across the Atlantic Ocean to London, having to explain why their monopoly is somehow losing money. And it's losing money because Askin is flooding the upper Great Lakes with very cheap New England rum. The interwar period and the early years of the American Revolution are going to be periods of lucrative a lucrative period in Askin's life, both professionally and personally. In 1772, for example, Askin traveled to Detroit and married a woman named Marie Archange Barth, the daughter of a nearly penurious French armorer and fur trader. This isn't Askin's first relationship in the Great Lakes, and while the records are spotty, all evidence points to at least two other relationships, beginning as early as 1764. These women, often indigenous or Métis, and one may even been a Panis slave or an enslaved indigenous woman, played important roles in Askin's trade, often serving as entry points into the indigenous communities of the Western Great Lakes. All told, at least 10 children came from these three different relationships, and they would grow up to navigate the cross-cultural and multi-ethnic world of their mothers and father. For example, Marie Archange Barth and her brothers are going to relocate to Michilimackinac, where they're going to quickly find important roles in Askin's own expansive network of trade. Their labor and their ties to the French and Indian worlds of the Great Lakes is going to allow Askin to maintain trading networks or depots at Michilimackinac, at Grand Portage on Lake Superior, Sault Ste. Marie, and these posts are going to serve large segments of the Great Lakes fur trade, particularly concerns like the Northwest Company, but also smaller independent traders alike. Askin's trade during this period is going to be voluminous, and he made it a goal. In one of his letters, he states he means to please everybody. He wants to be sort of a clearinghouse, a middleman par excellence for this kind of trade. I keep coming back to this because it's central to Askin's trade, but Askin trafficked extensively in alcohol. For example, in 1777, 46 merchants imported over 12,000 gallons of liquor to Michilimackinac alone. Askin accounted for 41.2% of this total. That's a huge number. And with a newly planned depot materializing at the mouth of the French River up at Georgian Bay, beginning in 1779, Askin was able to brag in front of the British military officials at Michilimackinac about, quote, having the key of Canada in his pocket, end quote. And you can look at all these fur trade licenses. They're all at the Peterson Center there in Mackinac City, and they're such an amazing source to look at. And in fact, the work done by people like David Armour and Keith Witter and so many others at putting material into the Peterson Center archive is amazing. There's actually a really good essay there on Askin by a man named John Graham that was really, really helpful when I began writing this book. I've never been able to find out what happened to John Graham or if he's still around. But I would very much like to thank him if anyone knows his contact information or what became of him. George Rogers Clark's Illinois campaign in 1778 and his capture of Henry Hamilton, the British lieutenant governor at Detroit, shortly resulted in this reshuffling of the British commandants in the Great Lakes and the Ohio Valley during the American Revolution. And it's this sequence of events in 1778 that's going to have very disastrous consequences for John Askin and his family and the newly arrived commandant, lieutenant governor of Michilimackinac, a man named Captain Patrick Sinclair. The removal of, or the promotion of Sinclair, or the arrival of Sinclair and the promotion of Arant Schuyler de Peyster is going to have important consequences for Askin as he begins to lose vital connections, important accommodations, and expectations that Askin's own trade relied upon. From 1779 to 1780, over a course of a year, Sinclair is going to dismiss Askin as a commissary. He's going to jail one of Askin's own son-in-laws. He's going to confiscate Askin's supplies from Askin's Sault Ste. Marie depot. And he's going to force one of Askin's brother-in-laws to remain in Detroit. And over the course of a year, Sinclair is going to dismantle Askin's network of trade. And after 16 years living at Michilimackinac, in 1780, Askin's going to leave Michilimackinac as he first entered it, nearly bankrupt. That's such a disastrous year in a person's life. It's hard to really quantify sort of the intensity of what that might have felt like. In the aftermath of this removal and in the aftermath of the American Revolution, Askin would in many ways recover and prosper, but often at the forbearance of his associates and his creditors. His family is going to remove to Detroit, and in 1786, with the help of people like Isaac Todd and James McGill at Montreal, Askin's going to help found something called the Miami Company, which was a fur trade consortium that focused its efforts on the Maumee and Wabash River Valley in the Illinois country. However, ongoing conflict between the new United States and the Western Indian Confederacy is going to make this kind of a disaster. In fact, during this period, Askin's also going to begin to speculate heavily in Great Lakes and Ohio Valley land. And after the Battle of the Fallen Timbers in 1794, for example, Askin, fur trader Alexander Henry, and a few others are going to scheme to try to buy a large swatch of northern Ohio. And their plan's going to fail spectacularly with the arrest of Askin's eldest son, John Jr., during the treaty signing at Greenville in 1795 by Anthony Wayne. Askin's son-in-law, or his oldest son, is going to be arrested for espionage. In 1796, after Jay's treaty, Askin and his family moved from Detroit to Upper Canada, where he would serve as a justice of the peace for the Western District, serve as a lieutenant colonel in the local militia. He's going to continue to invest heavily in lands. Askin's children, numerous sons and daughters and grandchildren from at least 3 different relationships, are going to leave his home and marry influential British and sometimes American spouses. These tended to be military men, fur trade women, or other eminent local officials. And they're all going to become important figures in their own right in a regional Canadian society. In fact, one of Susan Sleeper Smith's newest students, Aaron, is working on a wonderful dissertation on one of Askin's grandchildren. And if you're interested in what happens to Askin's children and grandchildren, his work is really amazing in that regard. Askin's going to die on his farm at the end of the War of 1812, in 1815, surrounded by his friends and family. Throughout his life, I argue in my book, Askin worked to twist, tie, and bind often competing and contradictory impulses of trade and empire into a workable understanding of what it meant to be a British subject and merchant in the Western Great Lakes. That's my book in a nutshell. I wrote that summary after rereading it for the first time in about 4 years. I last read my book in preparation for the indexing of my book, and that I think was one read too many, and it kind of broke my spirit. I had to take a pause from Askin. I kept talking about him, but I couldn't read my own writing for the longest time. It made me feel so icky and cringy and embarrassed. I don't know if that happens to authors, but it certainly happened to me. So over the last week, I've been rereading my book, and my son caught me rereading it and highlighting passages from it in my own personal copy. And I think he at one point respected me for writing a book, but I think now that having seen me reread it, I think he took that as an act of vanity. But really, the joke's on him. I actually don't remember a lot about what I wrote about the book. It all kind of blurred together. So it's been really nice and refreshing to go back to my book with fresh eyes and a clear heart and to see it from a very different perspective. Um, for example, in my book, I probably should have cited The Wire, the TV show from the 2010s, early 2000s, as an inspiration for my work, which seems kind of weird to say aloud, but my book is very much about economic uncertainty. It's about institutional dysfunction. It's about situational criminality, political and military corruption, and the ways in which individuals often work to negotiate the complex, the chaotic, and the shifting landscapes we find ourselves in. And that's definitely a theme that I know came out of the show. Even it did also come out of the historiography, but it's curious as to how vivid that show shows up in my mind as I reread this book. And I should pause here because the reason why I watched The Wire is because I was trying to date a woman at this time, and she recommended it. And at that point, I was so smitten with this person, I would have watched anything. She could have recommended Lost or like The Office, and I'm sure that would have influenced my work on Askin. That woman became my partner, Jana, and we are still together. And so I should probably pause here to thank her for helping with all the work I've done on this book. Rereading it this time around, I'm very impressed by the sheer criminality, at least from a modern perspective, that seems to have undergirded Askin's life and efforts in the Great Lakes. This is a story of smuggling, of bootlegging, of theft, of intimidation, of murder, of collusion, of price fixing, of quid pro quos, of espionage, of political corruption, and some very light treason, I might add. Askin goes bankrupt in 1764 because he cannot recoup the loss of furs from the liquor he was smuggling. In the 1770s, Askin's going to use the king's storehouse to maintain the fur trade during the disruptions caused by the American Revolution. Askin's collaborators vied with the Hudson Bay Company in the early 1770s because he traded in destructive quantities of New England rum, and as a middleman, he never had to see the consequences of his actions. And during the American Revolution, Askin's son-in-law, Samuel Robertson, who was tasked by Sinclair to help build the fortifications on the island, intercepts official governmental communications, doctors them in a way to ensure that their French engagés working at Sault Ste. Marie were not recruited for the war effort against the rebellious colonials, and thus disrupting Askin's trade. Meanwhile, while this is happening, the cabin boy tasked to deliver the falsified messages froze to death in a snowbank outside of the wooden fort. When I started writing this, I didn't think I was writing a crime story, but in retrospect, that's kind of what I was doing. Crime and criminality is a constant throb in Askin's story. In fact, I'm sure you all know this, but one of my favorite know about the source. But one of my favorite sources from this area or this era is published by the Mackinac State Park, and it's the secret private diary of Daniel Morrison. Morrison was a surgeon's mate attached to the British garrison, and he was a civilian, much like Askin was a civilian, as a commissary. And reading this source is amazing because the soldiers and the traders and like the leadership of the garrison made this guy's life miserable. Bullying, assault, battery, and theft. I've always wanted to interpret at Mackinac, to be an interpreter at the park, but I think I'd only ever do it if I'd only ever do it if I could play the role of Morrison. I think I could play a victim of bullying pretty well, I think. Um, Lastly, I think what's interesting to me about Askin and his life during the reread of my book is the degree to which all of the actions in this narrative are in some way the consequence and the benefit of weak state, military, and imperial power. In other words, I use Askin's life to say that these actions make the British Empire and the Great Lakes workable, even as they rendered the imperial project unsustainable. And I'm going to talk about Askin, Sinclair, and Patrick, and De Peyster, and I'll end my talk there to answer questions. But I think what makes Askin's relationship with Captain De Peyster and Captain Sinclair as commandants of Michilimackinac so interesting and compelling to me is the degree to which they're both confronted with similar behaviors by Askin, but both of the men interpret these behaviors in wildly different ways. At some point in October 1779, Askin, De Peyster, and Sinclair are all going to meet, and Askin's going to brag about having the key of Canada in his pocket. And he's talking about the French River Depot, and he's talking about his economic hold more than anything else. But De Peyster is going to respond to Askin fondly. He's going to have great memories of Askin. He's going to see Askin as a benefit rather than a distraction. De Peyster and men like De Peyster understood, I think, better than most British officials that empire at Michilimackinac was an act of negotiation, with the British Empire being in the weaker position. So when he gave Askin permission to do things like use the king's stores to bolster the fur trade, he did so because he understood in the Great Lakes how interconnected Indian policy, fur trade policy, and imperial policy truly were. There is weakness in this. This is a negotiation, but I think De Peyster saw this also as a relative strength. Sinclair, who was equally experienced in the Great Lakes, saw only the weaknesses as he surveyed Mackinac Island in 1778, 1779, 1780. His early tenure at Michilimackinac is one of fixation on the precariousness of the post. He had a very difficult job as a lieutenant governor, which is a civilian post, at a military posting, which is, I think, complex. And he saw Askin's boast as hostile in this light. Askin, in a matter of moments, switches from being an asset to the British Empire to a threat. And this leads to the destruction of Askin's trade and the very troubled tenure for Sinclair's term as lieutenant governor there, who he blames on Askin for causing so much trouble. He says, pouring with one commissary is causing me so much ill and trouble, and Askin is part of his downfall, he claims. Looking back on this project as a whole, I must say that I think Great Lakes stories are fundamentally interesting. And in places like the Great Lakes in the late 19th century and late 18th century and early 19th century are fundamentally interesting because they help illustrate the very tensions between the needs of the nation, state, or empire to establish boundaries and the ways in which everyday people occupying those spaces situationally negotiate, undermine, thwart, redirect, co-opt, and even employ these imperial efforts in creative and unique ways. I think this makes the Great Lakes stories provocative and unique, and I think this is why the Great Lakes continues to be a place of very fruitful study, and will continue to be into the future because it's a borderland porous space where empires and indigenous people are trying to negotiate what this might mean. And thank you for listening. And I'll pause here to answer questions because I don't want to use up too much time. I see a question from CJ Snyder.
That's Cindy.
Cindy, hi Cindy. She asked, is it unusual that Askin, an Irishman, was functioning in a world of British and French fur traders? That's a great question, and it's not unusual. Um, it's not unusual at all. In fact, I think there's Ireland, there's England, and there's Scotland. There's Great Britain, the United Kingdom, and then there's the British Empire. And what the British Empire allows colonized people to do, like the Irish, is to participate in these much larger imperial processes. So Askin is leaving Ireland because of British policy towards Ireland in terms of, what it can grow and how it can grow and how it can prosper. There's issues of rent racking and costs of living. But Askin is on one hand being displaced from Ireland because he's Irish and there's policies against the Irish. But even as he's able then to tap into these larger transatlantic networks that the British Empire is developing around the world. So it's not all that unusual. There's a reason why there's so many Scots, Irish and Scots people in the Great Lakes fur trade as a result of this. And there's a wonderful book, if anyone ever wants to write it, about the Battle of Culloden that takes place in the 1740s, and the General Hugh Mercer during the American Revolution, who's going to be at the Battle of Culloden, which sees the destruction of the Highland Scots, and he's also going to be at the Battle of Princeton. He's going to die at the Battle of Princeton, where he's a major general serving in the American resistance against the British Empire. So this movement of people across this transatlantic space, it was very common. In fact, his friends called him Paddy Askin, so he never lost his Irish identity. That was a great question. Thank you.
Does anybody else have any more questions?
Yeah, feel free. I love talking.
All right, well, I'll leave the chat open for a few minutes here. I'm going to put up our final screen here.
Okay. If you are interested in my book and you're interested in this period in general, there's two really interesting pop culture explorations. Major Robert Rogers shows up in that, and it's a really interesting portrayal of him. Also, Simcoe, who becomes the governor of Upper Canada, shows up, and he's a very interesting character in that. They don't treat him as kindly as they do Rogers. There's also a computer game called Assassin's Creed 3 that my students made me play at one point. If you ever get a chance to play that game, it takes place in this bizarro world, this bizarro portrayal of 18th century colonial American society, where Sir William Johnson shows up and you have to kill Sir William Johnson. It's bizarre. It's definitely fun. If you like my book or you like this stuff and you want more fantastical elements to it, then I would suggest those two things.
Also, on that note of your book, we do have copies of the book in our gift store. And our gift store, actually, if you're not local to the area, you can stop in. We're open Thursday through Monday from 12 to 5, and I think later hours on Saturday. But we will be online probably next week, too. So it should be available online.
Excellent. That's awesome. Other books, Susan Sleeper Smith's work's always great. Her work on the Ohio Valley is brilliant, if you ever have time to read that. Anything by Lucy Murphy, her book on Great Lake Creoles is really amazing. I'm a big fan of Masters of Empire by Michael McDonald. I use that in my own courses, and my students really like it. Of course, Keith Witter's book on Pontiac's War is excellent. In fact, I think Agnes Witter's article on Askin's library is one of the first things I've ever read about Askin. Of course, Brian Dunnigan's work on the island is amazing too. He has that wonderful maps and illustrations of Mackinac Islands, and that's lovely. There's so much good work being done on the Great Lakes right now, and it's exciting that you are highlighting parts of it. That's really cool.
So if nobody else has any more questions, I think we will finish up for the night. We just wanted to say thank you to everybody again for coming, and thank you, Justin, for excellent presentation. It was very interesting.
Thank you all.
Yeah, definitely. If you haven't been to our website, actually you will have been there because you registered, but you can go to our website and donate on our website. You can join our mailing list on our website, and all of our current events for the next few months, for the rest of the summer, will be up on there, and our Facebook page too. You can follow us along on Facebook. Have all of our current events and programs that are happening there too. So again, thank you, Justin. We really appreciate you coming and presenting for us. And I hope everybody has a good weekend and happy Friday. And if you have any questions, you can feel free to reach out either through the website or over email, and I will make sure that Justin gets your questions. And
please do.
Yeah.
Thank you all so much.
Yes, thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Rachel. That was awesome.
Yes, definitely. It was a very good conversation.
How many members does the Mackinac, does the Historical Society have, all told, do you know?
Our total member list?
Yeah.
About 180 or so.
Wow, that's awesome.
Yeah.
There's a really
It was this was definitely a good turnout. We had, like I said, there was 26 registered, and so I think we had 12 in and out throughout the talk. But I know some of the people register, we tell them that we send out the recording afterwards. So I know some people, I did have a few people reach out to me and say that they wanted to see the recording, but they weren't able to make the talk. So
that's awesome.
Yes, it's nice that we can get people to engage that way. So.
Yeah. I keep thinking about is COVID really affecting you guys' work up there, or has it been?
No,
I have to imagine.
It definitely is. Yeah, we actually, I said before, this online programming, this whole through Zoom kind of thing, this is brand new for us. We never did this before, and it was we always had people in person doing presentations, but this is new, and it's gone pretty well,
That's great. That's
kind of iron out the kinks and whatnot. We're actually in the process of moving our location.
Cool.
To a much bigger, better building. And so we're closed for the summer this year. The museum is closed to kind of pack up and, get ready for our move and whatnot. But like I said, our gift shop's still open. So we do still have that. And yes. So we're chugging along. I think it's affecting us just as much as everybody else.
Yeah. I think about how much of Mackinac City economy is based on people coming there, and how much that must be diminished right now. Like this is the first time, and I think in my entire, I've been going to Mackinac every summer since I was 3. And this is the first time that I haven't been there, and it feels so heartbreaking. It feels so sad not to lose that, but also not to know that I'm not helping, or it's frustrating.
Well, I was gonna say we're actually in St. Ignace. We're right across the bridge from Mackinac, but the tourism is definitely diminished. It's still we still have some people in town. There's definitely still some foot traffic. It's just a much different feel. There's a lot of people that we've noticed come and kind of, they come for camping or to do the cabins and things like that, and they really don't leave. They kind of stay in their campground, and I think they're just as scared as everybody else. They want to get away, but at the same time you don't want to expose yourself.
Exactly.
And so I know you work with Indiana University. Are you in Indiana?
I have an apartment there, but I live in Michigan. I commute back and forth. My partner lives in Michigan, so I go back and forth. So it's been fun.
That sounds fun. I was going to say,
lovely.
Yeah, it was really good. Thank you.
If I can do anything to help, even if it's not talking, if you ever need volunteers or anything like that, just let me know. I would love to help any way I can.
Well, would you mind if we add you to our email list?
Oh, of course, by all means. I thought I was at one point.
You very well may be. I was gonna say I know I put you on there to send this information out and everything, but that way if you ever see a program that looks interesting to you and you don't mind sharing it, that would be a huge help.
I'd love to. Yeah.
because I
particularly
know
during
you
the year,
have.
I can have my students come and as things, they're always looking for chances to be more involved with the field
Yeah,
itself. So yeah, definitely.
awesome. Okay,
Perfect.
great.
Well, thank you. Have a wonderful evening,
Yes,
Rachel.
thank you. You too. Thanks again.
Bye.
All right, bye.